Everybody, Todd Nash, President of Oregon Cattlemen's Association. I'm here today with John Nalivka. And John, you're with Sterling Marketing, and do you want to further introduce yourself, a little bit about what you do there and where you're from?
Yeah, it's good. It's good to be on with you today, Todd. Yeah, I've had Sterling. We started Sterling Marketing in 1991, and I've owned it since '94. And it's essentially I do market advisory and economic research for clients across the entire supply chain of the red meat industry, going from producer all the way to the into distribution and retail, with a large share of my clients are packers and processors, but also large chain restaurant companies. I have quite a few of those as clients. So I've been doing this for, well, it's well over 30 years. So anyway, we moved to Vail in '94, and doesn't matter where I'm located. My business is pretty much over with a computer or over the telephone, or I go and sit in clients' offices. So, but deal with all aspects of the market and the industry structure. I do a lot with capacity and margins. So anyway, that's a little bit about Sterling Marketing.
Okay, well, I've gotten to know you a little bit over the years and heard several presentations from you, and you are a tremendous wealth of knowledge. And so for the purposes of today, I wanted to talk about kind of what you see out into the future there. And, we've had a pretty robust demand for beef for going back for quite a few years in the United States. The demand for cattle hasn't necessarily reflected what we've seen at the pricing level for beef. When can we expect that pendulum to really flip to where we could catch up and cattle prices really reflect what's going on with inflation and the input costs that we're bearing right now?
Well, I think as we head into next year, Todd, our numbers, we went through a very significant liquidation over the last 2 years, and particularly during this year with liquidating cow herds and also heifers. There's absolutely very, very few heifers that have gone into the herd, and with the largest share of them going on feed. And we've seen that our year to date, our beef cow slaughter is up 13% over a year ago, and that's the highest rate of cow slaughter since 1985. So it's I think we're going to see the result and the impact of this liquidation is into next year as our numbers start to decline pretty sharply. That'll, I think it's so dependent. I think supply wise, I think it's not hard to come to the conclusion where we're heading into next year with regard to numbers. I think the big question and is the demand side of the equation. If demand stays fairly solid as it has been, and certainly we've seen a significant improvement in demand over the last 5 years, and that's across the entire supply chain. That's the quality of the cattle, the quality of the carcass, and I think it's proven that people will buy a quality product and they're willing to pay for it. And if we can just maintain that, both on the with the U.S. consumer and our exports, then I think we're going to see right now my forecast for next year are to see about a 15% increase in prices for feeder calves and feeder cattle as we go into next year. So I think it'll also come to bear. And again, it's so much dependent upon the demand side of the equation.
Okay. And I had heard that the 13% slaughter year over, and it was up 8% the year previous to that is what I understand.
Yeah.
And then heifer slaughter this year, there was a time when there was more females getting killed than than steer cattle. You want to talk about the anomaly of that? Have you seen that before?
Well, it's, yeah, our heifer slaughter, year to date is up 5% over a year ago, and steer slaughter's down 1%. So it's really proven, I mean, that this has been our slaughter, basically our slaughter mix this year is simply just, showing, liquidation at, probably, which we have never seen to this level before. As far as we will slaughter this year, the percentage of the cow herd that we're slaughtering this year will be the highest since 1977, and as well as the heifer slaughter as well. So I think one thing too that's important, and I bring this up, I brought this up at the ICA convention last week, was that we've got to keep in mind the efficiency of our production today versus you don't have to go, you can go back to 2014-15 when we last saw these, had record prices, or you can go back further, but we've seen a significant increase in production efficiency. And it doesn't matter whether you're talking about steers or heifers, either one, as far as the carcass weights. But I continually throw out the number. We talk about this, I throw this word sustainability around. I get having a little bit of a problem with that, because I think anybody who's been in business in this industry for 50 years, I think they've demonstrated sustainability. And as far as the entire industry, we're producing in 2022, and we, for all practical purposes, this is an estimate now, but we'll produce 5 billion more pounds of beef in 2022 than we did in 1975, and we're doing it with 40 million fewer head of cattle. I think that's significant, and I think it's worth every rancher, every cattleman in this country, when the word sustainability gets brought up in the discussion, that's the first thing I would throw right back out. I'd say, you want to talk about sustainability, when you can produce 5 billion more pounds of product with 40 million fewer head of cattle than we did, nearly 50 years ago. I think there's something to be said about that. But going back to with your first question, Todd, is that that's part of the issue with live cattle prices, is that our production per head is so much greater, and it simply takes fewer cattle to for what we'll go through and what the industry can market in a week. So it's kind of turned up things a little bit upside down, but I think certainly as we go into next year, we're starting on the right back to a more from the standpoint of people staying in business, is going to be more sustainable. That's for sure.
Okay. And on that, John, the high quality beef and what it really takes to get there, we're looking at an over 900-pound carcass, and sometimes substantially over 900 pounds. As these feed costs projected to be basically the same as what the live cattle are going to be, and sometimes upside down, how do you keep putting pounds on? What encourages people to keep putting pounds on to make that higher quality product when you may be losing money in the feedlot?
It's getting to the grade, and we're seeing so much of a premium on those higher quality carcasses, those upper 2/3 choice and prime carcasses, that we've offset that cost to gain. And certainly the cost to gain right now is nearly record high. It's not quite as high as we were back in 2012 and 13, but and that becomes somewhat of the limitation, obviously, on the value of these feeder, the prices on these feeder cattle, because the cost of gain is so high. It was interesting, as we came into this year, and you would never have thought that we would feed these cattle as big as we did, and simply because of that cost of gain issue and what it was costing. The values, just as show you kind of an example, is that I've mentioned several times this year, people talk about getting these 8-weight cattle back up to 245, where the record price was back in 2014, in the spring of 2014. Well, it's a little difficult to do when your cost of gain is $300 a head greater than it was in 2014. So if you took today's cattle with today's cost of gain, and you pulled that 8-weight, that feeder cattle price up to 245, you'd have a break even of $1.85 coming out of the lot. And I don't know about anybody else, but I have a little difficulty with that. And you'd have to be terribly optimistic to think that you could cover the break even with where the market's going to. We may get to $1.65 fairly easily next spring, but I think $1.85 is a stretch. So, but simply put, going back to your question, it's as long as the value of those additional pounds exceed the cost of putting those pounds on, even as high as it is, the cattle will keep the carcasses big. We'll keep the cattle big, simply because we're getting that premium on those prime cattle. And the spread, it was significant last spring, the prime choice spread on these cattle. So it shows people will pay for quality, and that's simply where we're at today.
Yeah. And going back to 2014, we saw what we might be seeing here in the near future too, with just hamburger. And I remember July of 2014, I sold some fat cattle. They came out of the feedlot. They brought $1.54. The same week, I took a bull to the sale, and I got $1.58 for him. Yeah. And so that finished product, regardless of what it was, whether it was high quality or it was hamburger, was all worth about the same money. Do you see any of that happening? And where do you see our butcher cow and butcher bull market headed into the near future?
Well, I think on a live weight, these cows, and I guess I've been somewhat surprised this year, and it comes out, really what you're saying, and we've seen these cow prices, given where our cow slaughter's been, the cow prices this year have been, really very, very, the cow market's been pretty strong. And I always go back and relate everything to the meat side, because that's the side that I do a lot of work with clients on we spent a lot of time this year doing pricing on 90s and 50s and 75s and 80s on these for this, just the ground beef side of it. But I think as we go in, potentially we could cut this cow slaughter back pretty sharply next year. And I've got it. Well, I'll tell you, I've got beef cow slaughter down about, nearly 25% from where we were this year. If we go into next year and everything holds together, and again, the supply side is not the issue, it's the demand side. And along that line, if we get into a recession and all the pieces are kind of together for that situation, but you'll still hold your ground beef market together, because people will reduce their consumption and their buying of the high-end cuts, and the ribeye is what's been the real driver in this market, is these ribeyes. But if people decide they simply are not going to or cannot, buy $11 or $12 ribeyes, then they're still going to buy the ground beef. And the quality of that ground beef is really pretty good compared to what it used to be, and people don't mind, I think, paying, well, I shouldn't say everybody, but I think there's a lot of people that don't, pay, $4 and $5 a pound for a really, really high quality ground beef product. And that will support those cow prices. And you pull that slaughter down as much as I anticipate on these cows. I mean, it's going to give these cow prices an even greater boost from where we've been this year. So, and the price this year wasn't that bad. So it, you kind of start pulling the thing apart, taking the pieces apart and looking at each part of it. It all kind of has its own story as we go into next year. And as I've always said, beef is not beef. Beef is a whole lot of subprimals on that carcass and ground beef, and you got to look at each one of those things, somewhat separately, and then put all the pieces together to really kind of describe the market then.
Well, one of the things, John, that we've heard over the last few years is hook space. There's just not enough hook space and capacity in the packing side of things in order to have more demand from the packers for cattle. And we know we've been backed up at times during COVID and workforce issues and different things. If we get to a point to where we have and we're reducing our herd, if packers really have to go out and compete again, do you see the template of just being, we'll just shut down a plant when we'll have less hook space and that being a strategy?
The packers want to operate every day, and I have a little trouble with what's being described as not enough capacity, slaughter, and we I think most people do. You look at capacity in a packing plant as slaughter capacity. Well, it goes well beyond that. You can slaughter cattle all day long if the cattle are available, but getting those cattle through the fab line and through the further processing is become to say probably a challenge would be a nice way of saying it, simply because of the labor part of these plants, and the labor's become such an issue. I guess, and I've said this, and probably a lot of people don't necessarily agree with me or outright don't agree with me, but I would rather have a packer down the road who is financially solid and knows that plant's going to open tomorrow, because we've seen so many of these plants and startup plants that it all looked good in the beginning, but it was a tough go simply because they had so much debt. And a little bit of the problem today too is these private equity firms that are put money into these, they quickly lose interest when things start getting tough on financially. So there's plants, we all know there's plants that have been sold 3 or 4 times till they finally got sold for 20 cents on the dollar, and somebody bought them and made them work. Well, they made them work simply because they got bought for 20 cents on the dollar. But I think the packers have done a lot towards the value added part of this beef product, and it's the value added. And you can talk about branded items that steaks, or you can go all the way down to hamburger patties and ground chubs of ground beef. And I've got clients, they buy directly from packers now with a quality product, and they buy patties from that packer versus buying the packer selling chubs and raw material to a processor, and that processor making patties. So it just makes a difference on the structure of the industry. But again, it takes everybody in the supply chain going the same direction And particularly when you're getting into, value added items, it starts with the cattle. You've got to have the the right genetics to produce the right calf that's going to be healthy, that's going to feed well and come out of that feed lot, and the carcass is going to grade and everything going forward. It can't, because the packers need the cattle, they need quality cattle, and it all takes all those pieces together. It can't be all broken down into separate parts, as we used to kind of think of it. So there's some plants. I have made the comment, and I believe I'm right, but if on a startup plant today, there's still the labor, and there are some of these new plants that rest assured they will work. And I don't think I'm a firm believer the new agri beef plant in Jerome is going to be that plant is the right plant in the right place with the right drive behind it, simply because it's driven by a branded product. And that has a lot to do with success in this industry, is these branded products. I think the sustainable beef plant in Nebraska, when you have Walmart as one of your major investors, I think there's probably no problem with that plant making it either. But it really gets down to labor, and I've had the comment made to me, well, I can pay an extra $1 an hour, and those guys working at that plant down the road, they'll come right down here. Well, maybe so, or maybe no. I think where we are on wage rates in this industry today, it wasn't so long ago, the wage rate in these plants range between $15 and $18 or $15 and $20 an hour. And in the spring of 2020, when we got in Iraq, those wage rates, or 2021 actually, those wage rates were pulled up and ranged from $21 to $28. And so, and that was driven by the decision by one packer, and everybody else had to follow suit. So it's kind of, we'll see where we end up with this capacity, but basically capacity utilization in the industry has been running all this year at about 90% on average. And if you don't change, if you only take the current capacity and look at that as we go into next year, and the supply of cattle being down 6%, well, the math on capacity utilization is not too terribly difficult. It comes down to about 84% utilization. And, we've had it as low as 80%, back in 2014, we were running at about 80%. So we start adding new capacity, then it, all the dynamics and the math of all that kind of start to change pretty significantly.
Okay. Well, good information, John. We're getting fairly in depth here. Getting back to the producer, there's nothing that is more inefficient than the ranch where the cattle are raised itself. And is there concern from those in the supply chain that we have ranchers that aren't profitable anymore, and we're fastly putting people out of business, and is there concern at that level back to the ground?
Yeah, I think that's a huge topic for discussion. And I don't know how. I think when you start breaking down the financial well-being of everybody in the industry, it's as I've always said, every ranch is an individual ranch, and you can't start using the word average in this industry is a very poor adjective to use. I was told years ago, I was this is going back into the late 80s, I was in a packing plant with a client, and I used the word, we were just kind of having a conversation sitting in his office, and I used the word average about one time too many, and he kind of he schooled me on using that word in this industry, and I've been afraid to use it ever since. But I think we get a little caught up in trying to evaluate the financial well-being of the producers, ranchers in this industry, and there's a different set of circumstances around every ranch, and how that ranch operates, and how they're going to operate going forward. And maybe it's not something everybody wants to talk about, but economies of scale is extremely important in this industry. And I did my graduate work at the University of Nevada on that very topic, and looked at how the difference in the finances on ranches of various sizes. And it's the difference of having 20 cows versus 300 is pretty significant. And at the same time, you've got to have I think the problem that we end up in with today in the West is you want to expand, and you want to increase the scale of your ranch, and maybe the neighbor's ranch comes up for sale, but I'm just not quite sure how you buy these ranches at $20,000 a cow unit. I think it'd take a sharper pencil than I could ever put to it. But there's ways of sitting down, but I think, and I really say this, Todd, and I'll emphasize it, you've got to sit down and really push a pencil and know the economics of your ranch. And it doesn't do anything to look at the numbers that John Nalivka does as far as cow-calf return. I mean, the number I used to come up with a general index is I think the cost of production are running right around $800 a head right now on a lot of ranches, on most ranches. That's high. That is very, very high. And I think that there's ranches that are significantly higher than that. But I think rather than saying, well, we're gonna sell $3, we're gonna sell 5-weight calves for $3 next year, so I'm not gonna worry about it. I'll just let that all. I think it's time to sit down and say, what can I do in terms of evaluating really, really critically the economics of this ranch that I operate on, and will it make a difference if I can increase my carrying capacity and run more cows or whatever it might be, but do that as opposed to just saying, well, it's all going to get taken care of because 5-weight calves are going to be $3 next year. They may be, and there's a lot of things that can happen between now and then. So does that kind of answer your question, Todd?
It does, yeah. And I want to end with a final question. We can talk about the economics of capacity and having larger ranches, and that all being well and good. I think the average cattle ranch in the United States is somewhere around 40 head and somewhere around 45 head in Oregon. And so how do you address that? And what advice do you give for across the landscape in Oregon as far as good marketing practices and things that can maybe affect your bottom line?
I think, and I will say this as strongly as I can, people have got to get involved in the programs, the branded programs. And you can do that with a program that's, we know what they are in Oregon, or there's Oregon country beef, and there's or country natural beef, and there's Painted Hills. You've got opportunities to get into these programs where you can capture these premiums on these cattle and get paid for raising quality cattle. Now, having said that, if you've got 20 cows and you're hearing around, well, people would like to buy, carcass beef, or they'd like to buy from one producer, because it is a big deal. There's no doubt about it. People want to know where their food comes from. And particularly when it comes to, whether it be beef or pork or whatever, people put a lot of credence in that. Well, I buy a half a beef from Joe Rancher down the road. I've been on his ranch. I see the cattle. I know how I know he takes care of them, and everything's done right. And I don't mind paying more for that half a carcass of beef, because that's the things that make me happy. Well, there's a lot of people that are willing to, that are buying beef like that. And, you start it, but you got to really shift gears a little bit and go from simply production and I got to get X, Y, and Z done. I don't have time. You got to put marketing as a priority. And I think that even when you start as you start into January, you start out and really think about marketing and putting that marketing as a priority of what you're going to do in the coming year and years beyond that. And I think there's the real potential. We're not going to see what we see as a typical herd expansion as we go out, real quickly and see people, right away holding back heifers. Well, even at the very best, there's no heifer retention this year to build the herd. So even if that happens next year at this time, you don't see the result of that until 2025, at the earliest. So I think the potential exists right now if people put that on the top of the list of priorities of marketing. And I know production's important, but instead of just getting down to July, well, I'm going to go to the Superior Video in July, so I don't have to worry about it. We'll start worrying about it a little bit, I just think it's important. So knowing your costs down to the decimal point and thinking about how to best market those cattle that you produce on that ranch. I think if people go into 2023 with those on the top of their list, and I think that there's opportunity to change the success rate in this industry. I guess I'll put it that way. You should be looking towards success and not survival.
Yeah, I agree, John. Good advice. Really appreciate you getting on here today, and we'll wrap this up. I think this is the longest segment I've done for cattlemen's, but it's a topic that is of concern, and the guys that have been struggling to just keep going these last few years, and going into what you probably predict 25 before we see any significant turnaround. How to maneuver through this, capture the best market that we can during this time is really relevant, and we're spending a little time on. So any final thoughts before we close her off here today?
That's kind of what I will likely be at the convention in January, so we'll kind of see as we start into the year in the early part, see if things are going the right direction.
Yeah. Okay. Really appreciate you, John, and all that you do for our industry and all you've provided for us over the years. So,
yeah. Thank you, Todd. I appreciate the opportunity to be on with you today.
You bet. We'll talk to you later.
Okay. Bye.